Welcome. This is Najma Minhas with Global Village Space. Pakistan this year has faced its worst floods in decades. It's lost over 1,700 people to the floods. Over one third of the country has been affected, and an estimated $30 billion of losses have been made. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has stated that developing countries everywhere are looking down the barrel of climate-driven disasters. The United Nations itself has recently pledged that it will raise climate funding for developing countries, but these pledges are not new. Rich countries have made these in the past and have not delivered. To share his thoughts, I'm joined by eminent economist Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. He is the director for the Sustainable Development Center at Columbia University. Jeffrey, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Jeffrey, Pakistan, for example, releases around 1% to carbon emission gases. A country like the United States releases around 29%. We know that historically, due to the process of industrialization, it is the global north that's responsible for the vast majority of climate change. Do you think it's fair game for developing countries to ask for climate reparations?
Of course, the rich countries have responsibilities to the poorer countries for the damages that the poorer countries are incurring and for the extra costs that the poorer countries are going to incur to make society safe from these disasters. There are three kinds of investments for climate safety, and I want to distinguish them. One is the energy transformation, or sometimes called mitigation. That means to decarbonize the energy system. Every country really is responsible for that.
Right.
The second is what we call adaptation, which is living in this terrible new reality. And the third is what's called losses and damages. After Pakistan's disastrous flood this summer, the costs are enormous. As you say, more than $30 billion, more than 10% of the gross domestic product, but with consequences that are going to be with Pakistan for years to come. So the question is, how do we get this done? And all three of those categories, whether it's the energy system change, the adaptation, or responding to losses and damages, requires finance. My own view is that two of these categories, losses and damages and adaptation, really are the responsibility heavily of the rich world that caused this mess. On the mitigation side, my view is every country has the obligation to not pollute. So I don't think anybody gets a free pass on polluting. What countries need for the first category, mitigation, is long-term, low-interest loans so you can make the energy transformation. But, you know, with the floods in Pakistan, with the extreme hurricanes and typhoons, with the droughts that Africa has suffered, the poorer countries need to say to the richer countries, time up, we're finished talking, you pay up right now. And we're going to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, hosted by Egypt. Egypt's on top of this. It's time for the G77 and China to raise the voice very, very strongly.
Right.
No more time for talk. We need the money now because the disasters are now. They're not in the future.
So you refer to the fact that some kind of funding needs to be available, but you're referring to it as loans rather than funding itself.
No. Funding for losses and damages is grants because this is disaster. The loans come for the energy transformation because when you build an energy system, people pay for power over time. But what's needed there is low interest and very long-term loans, not 3-year Euro bonds or 5-year Euro bonds with backbreaking interest rates, but 40-year loans with very low interest rates. Then that's manageable, but not for the other categories, losses and damages and adaptation. Countries like Pakistan need the money. They need grant financing. And the rich countries should be taxing themselves under an international formula that reflects how they've contributed to this mess.
Do you have any thoughts on that formula in terms of who puts the money in, how does it get distributed, where does the pot go to ultimately?
If you take the floods, it's a very illustrative example. what do we know about the causes of the flooding? Well, clearly there are global factors at play, because it was the global warming that led to the massive monsoon that Pakistan incurred. There are other factors at play: deforestation in the upper Himalayas, the faulty infrastructure that reduces drainage. Also, by the way, melting glaciers, which is another global warming phenomenon. So when you try to assess how much of this flood damage is globally caused, how much is locally caused, that's what we call attribution. That's a good starting point. I think with the Pakistan floods, at least half is going to be due to the global factors. And that's at least the half of the 30 billion or more that the rich countries that are responsible ought to be paying. I believe that we should be levying an assessment based on those historical emissions. And we can calculate those. We have records back basically to 1850. And for some countries even earlier, to say, this is what you've done. Now you pay a small amount per ton of CO2 that you've emitted in the past that is responsible for a significant part of these losses into a fund. That fund goes to countries to help them to adapt and to respond to disasters.
Okay, so but the thing is that in 2009, for example, the rich countries pledged $100 billion by 2020 per annum for specifically this reason, but they didn't put any money in. How does the global South, who's suffering particularly from these effects, actually strategize to get this money? What do they need to do?
They need to get together on a plan now. I do think the G77, by the way, is a good place for this. And there are many like-minded countries, I can tell you, because I speak with lots of governments. The small island developing states, and there are dozens of them, they're suffering rising sea levels, storms, and so on, exactly of this kind. And they are making demands as well. Brazil has been a country in the lead on this case for historic responsibility. And so Brazil, especially if President Lula is reelected as president, is going to be a real champion of this cause. Indonesia is host of the G20 this year. They understand this, what's at stake. Egypt is host of COP27. They understand what's at stake. So I think just even in the few weeks until the climate conference, and then that's followed immediately by the G20, it's necessary to insist on this. Back in 2009, by the way, the G7 really ran the show. They said, oh, we don't want to talk about this. But the developing countries are becoming a larger and larger part of the world economy and of world politics. And I think they'll be a larger and more decisive part of decision-making as well, if there's a common voice.
Bilawal Bhutto, Pakistan's foreign minister, has 2-3 times referred to the Green Marshall Plan. What exactly is this? I mean, and what do you think the likelihood of something like this coming about?
Well, the Marshall Plan, of course, refers to U.S. foreign aid to Europe after World War II. It was named after General George Marshall. It was a lot of money spent at the time. It helped rebuild Europe. It had geopolitical purposes for the United States as well, let's be clear. But the problem with Marshall Plans now is the U.S. has become incredibly ungenerous internationally. The U.S. is one of the main reasons why we don't have any of these funds, because even after the pledges are made, I know in the back rooms, the U.S. is the foot dragger on all of this, more than almost any other country. So Marshall Plan, we're not going to have if it's literally meaning that the United States is somehow going to show far-sighted generosity. It's not the reality right now. I would give it a different name, but I would say that it is the Sustainable Development Fund. It is the Climate Justice Fund, and it is absolutely needed, and not because of aid, not because of charity, although those are fine, but because of historical responsibility. If this were a court of law within a country, those who are suffering would sue those who have created these damages. But since
Right.
we're in an international context, we do it through diplomacy. We can't really do it effectively through a court of law.
So do you think something, I mean, given the fact that taking money out of someone's purse today is a bit more difficult, there are suggestions of other kind of out of the box kind of ideas, such as debt cancellation, which is previous debt, so you don't feel it so much. Similarly, for a country like Pakistan, GSP plus, the fact that European countries, for example, could contribute their amount that they are due to pay in terms of GSP plus, which is trade for Pakistan, and Pakistan would make money. What do you think about ideas like that?
Well, I'm never against something that actually would be negotiated at the end. I like to think of things a little bit more straightforwardly, which is that we know that the damage comes from greenhouse gas emissions. We know where the greenhouse gas emissions came from. We know the scale of the problem. We can therefore calculate a kind of assessment that could be seen as fair, sensible, efficient, proper response, as if this were a court of law adjudicating liability for damages. So I like the clean approach. On the other hand, the clean approach isn't delivering right now. So there's a question diplomatically, geopolitically, how to really get this done. I would not say no to anything that's going to work.
What is the feasibility, though, of that happening? Are developed countries thinking about these kind of ideas, or they're not thinking at all? I mean, what do we see happening in the developed countries? They talk about it, they make pledges, but in terms of actual bang on the buck, what are we going to get from them?
In the United States, there's a real resistance because our politics are profoundly libertarian, meaning rich people say, leave us alone. We don't have responsibility to anyone, anywhere, within our country or internationally. The US is quite frustrating in this regard, but other countries understand that there's real logic to this. You know, it makes sense. They get it. They don't like it. Maybe the politicians don't think this is easy, but I think people see this issue coming to a head because for a long time, climate was something terrible that was going to happen in the future. We're going to suffer. But now we're in the middle of this climate change. It's not something about the future. It is the here and now. Right. And the rich countries can't keep running. By the way, the developing countries also have big responsibilities to change the energy system. This is clear. This is a global effort that's needed right now. But when it comes to these damages and these adaptation costs, the rich countries are going to have to face the truth. I think it can get done. Right now, the mood is terrible because, you know, we're more every day talking about war and destruction in Ukraine and the tensions between the US and China. So it's an awful situation because these countries are not behaving properly. They're focused on conflict rather than on problem solving. But I think the rest of the world is really focused on the problems and the need for solutions. And we therefore need the voice of 150 countries that say, come on, to the rest, to the few rich countries, really rich countries, you've got to step forward. The world cannot go on this way with you acting with impunity. I think eventually it's going to work.
Well, it's interesting. Earlier you mentioned that the US is not feeling so generous now. But really, the Marshall Fund was all about the United States foreign policy rather than any climate-driven or any kind of generosity that the US did what it did. So maybe we need more of a foreign policy element to climate change before anything takes place there. My final question to you would be...
I think, by the way, if I could say, the US is looking for friends these days. Developing countries need to say, look, you want to be a friend, we've got floods. You want to be a friend, we've got typhoons. You want to be a friend, we've got rising sea levels. Get real. Don't talk to us about wars and sanctions and so forth. How about our problems? And I think that would make a real difference because our diplomats would hear an earful of something really useful.
Yeah, no, I agree. So a final question to you is, what role do corporates play in this climate justice equation?
First of all, we're really going to make an energy transformation. We are, because we have to. So corporates that drag their feet and think that they're living in the 20th century are going to find that basically they lose over the longer term. Those that bet on electric vehicles or hydrogen or zero carbon energy are going to be the ones that are going to lead the way. The richest man in the world, Elon Musk, is the one that bet on electric vehicles before others were thinking about it. He bet right. He became a gazillionaire. And I would say to businesses, that's the right way to go. The other thing I would say to businesses is don't lobby against climate sanity. You know, especially the oil, gas, and coal companies. They played a terrible role in stopping or slowing the response, and they must not play politics that way with the future of the planet.
Dr. Sachs, thank you so much for your time today.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.